polished marble floors of the Whitmore Industries headquarters reflected the morning sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the executive boardroom. Richard Whitmore, 73 years old and worth over $2 billion, adjusted his Italian silk tie as he prepared for what would be the most important board meeting of his life. His weathered hands, despite their age, moved with the precision of a man who had built an empire from nothing. Richard's steel-gray eyes swept across the mahogany conference table where his family members were already seated, their faces expectant, yet impatient. His eldest son, Michael, 48, drummed his manicured fingers against the table's surface, his Armani suit perfectly tailored, but unable to hide the soft paunch that came from years of boardroom lunches rather than honest work. Beside him sat his daughter, Catherine, 45. Her blonde hair pulled back in a severe chignon that matched her perpetually disapproving expression. The younger generation clustered at the far end of the table. His grandchildren, all in their 20s, each more entitled than the last. They scrolled through their phones with barely concealed boredom, their trust funds having long since insulated them from any real understanding of struggle or sacrifice. Richard's personal attorney, James Morrison, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had served the Whitmore family for over 3 decades, shuffled through a stack of legal documents. The papers rustled in the oppressive silence, each sound amplified by the tension that had been building for weeks since Richard had announced this mysterious family meeting. "Dad, can we please get on with this?" Michael's voice carried the irritation of a man accustomed to having his time valued above all else. "I have a conference call with the Tokyo office in an hour." Richard nodded slowly, his gaze drifting momentarily to the window where he could see the city sprawling below them. Somewhere, in those crowded streets, in a small auto repair shop on the wrong side of town, was the person who had changed everything, the person who had shown him what it meant to love without condition, without expectation of gain. "There's something you all need to know," Richard began, his voice steady despite the earthquake he was about to unleash. "Something I should have told you years ago." Catherine leaned forward, her pearl necklace catching the light. "Is this about the succession plan? Because we've been waiting for months to discuss the transition of power." "In a way, yes." Richard's fingers found the simple gold band he had been hiding beneath his more ostentatious family ring for the past 3 years. With deliberate slowness, he removed the ornate signet ring and placed it on the table, revealing the wedding band beneath. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. 3 years ago, I got married," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I married someone who loves me for who I am, not what I'm worth. Someone who knew me before any of you were even born, though we lost touch for decades." Michael's face flushed red, his composure cracking. "What are you talking about? You've been widowed since Mom died 15 years ago. There's been no one—" "There has been someone," Richard interrupted, his tone carrying an authority that had built boardrooms and crushed competitors. "Her name is Elena Rodriguez. She owns Rodriguez Auto Repair on Maple Street. We were married in a small ceremony at City Hall 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while Michael's hands clenched into fists on the polished table surface. "A mechanic?" The word came out of Catherine's mouth like something distasteful she needed to spit out. "You married a mechanic?" "I married a woman who fixed my car when it broke down in her neighborhood, and in doing so, she fixed something in me that I didn't even realize was broken," Richard said, his eyes taking on a warmth they rarely showed in corporate settings. "She doesn't know about the board meeting today. She doesn't know about the changes I'm about to announce." James Morrison cleared his throat nervously, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Richard, perhaps we should discuss the legal implications privately before—" "No." Richard's voice cut through, the attorney's objection like a blade. "They need to hear this. All of it." He stood up, his tall frame still imposing despite his age, and walked to the window. The city stretched out before him, a testament to the empire he had built through decades of ruthless business practices and calculated risks. But looking down at those streets, he could only think of Elena's laugh, the way her eyes crinkled, when she smiled, and how she had never once asked him for anything except his honesty. Elena has been my wife for 3 years, which means she is entitled to certain rights under state law. Rights that affect all of you. Richard turned back to face his family, his expression resolute. But more than that, she has shown me what really matters. Not quarterly reports or stock prices or maintaining the family legacy. She matters. Michael shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward. You can't be serious. You're going to let some gold-digging mechanic destroy everything we've worked for? What have you worked for, Michael? Richard's question hung in the air like a challenge. When was the last time you actually earned something instead of having it handed to you? The room erupted in chaos as voices rose in anger, disbelief, and panic. Catherine was frantically texting someone, probably her own attorney, while the grandchildren had finally looked up from their phones, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that their comfortable futures might not be as secure as they had assumed. Richard watched the pandemonium with a strange sense of peace. For 3 years, he had carried this secret, protecting Elena from his family's inevitable reaction, while protecting his family from a truth he knew would devastate them. But secrets, he had learned, were like pressure cookers. Eventually, they exploded. As he looked at their faces, twisted with greed and entitlement, he thought of Elena in her small apartment above the auto shop, probably making breakfast with the same gentle care she brought to everything she did. She had no idea that in revealing their marriage, he was about to tear apart not just his family, but the very foundations of the empire that bore his name. The truth was finally out, and there would be no going back. Elena Rodriguez wiped her, hands on the oil-stained rag that perpetually hung from her tool belt, her dark eyes focused on the engine before her. At 68, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 5 decades understanding the intricate dance of pistons, valves, and timing belts. Her small auto shop on Maple Street wasn't much to look at. The paint was peeling, the floors were stained with decades of automotive fluids, and the waiting area consisted of 3 mismatched chairs surrounding a coffee table held together with duct tape. But Elena's shop was her kingdom, a place where she could solve problems with her hands and her mind, where people trusted her judgment, and where the sound of engines running smoothly was the sweetest music she knew. The bell above the door chimed, and Elena looked up to see Mrs. Patterson from down the street, her face flushed with excitement and something that looked like concern. "Elena, dear, have you seen the news?" Mrs. Patterson clutched her smartphone like it contained state secrets. "There's something on the business channel about that husband of yours." Elena's stomach dropped. She had always known this day might come, had dreaded it even as she cherished every moment of happiness Richard had brought into her life. For 3 years, they had existed in their own private world, stolen dinners at small restaurants where no one recognized him, quiet evenings in her apartment, weekend drives in her old pickup truck to places where the Whitmore name carried no weight. "What kind of news?" Elena asked, though she was already reaching for the small television in her office, the one that usually played old movies during lunch breaks. Mrs. Patterson held out her phone, and Elena saw Richard's face filling the screen. He looked older than she remembered, more tired, but his eyes held the same gentle strength that had first attracted her when his Bentley had broken down outside her shop 4 years ago. The news anchor's voice was crisp and professional. In a shocking turn of events, billionaire businessman Richard Whitmore has revealed a secret marriage that threatens to shake the foundations of his business empire. Sources close to the family report that Whitmore married Elena Rodriguez, a local auto mechanic, 3 years ago without informing his family or board of directors. Elena sank into her desk chair, the weight of decades suddenly pressing down on her shoulders. She had grown up in this neighborhood, had inherited this shop from her father, had built a life of quiet dignity through honest work and treating people fairly. The idea of being thrust into the spotlight of Richard's world terrified her more than any engine problem she had ever faced. Her phone began ringing, first her landline, then her cell phone. The numbers were unfamiliar, and she let them go to voicemail. Through the shop's front window, she could see a van pulling up across the street, satellite dish extended like an electronic periscope. 20 miles away, in the marble and glass tower that housed Whitmore Industries, the family meeting had devolved into something resembling a war council. Michael paced behind his father's chair like a caged animal, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor with each agitated step. "We need to contain this immediately," Michael said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Every minute this story is out there, our stock price drops another point. The board is already calling for an emergency session." Catherine sat rigidly in her chair, her laptop open as she scrolled through news articles and social media posts. "It's everywhere, Dad. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, even the gossip sites. They're calling her a gold digger, a fortune hunter. Some blogger is already speculating about how much she'll get in a divorce settlement." Richard's jaw clenched at the characterization of Elena, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Elena has never asked me for a single penny. She doesn't even know the full extent of our holdings. I paid for our marriage license with cash from my wallet because she insisted on splitting it 50-50. That's what makes this worse," Michael exploded, finally stopping his pacing to face his father directly. "Don't you see? She's either the most patient con artist in history, or she's genuinely naive about what she's walked into. Either way, she's about to become a liability we can't afford." James Morrison, the family attorney, looked up from his phone with grave concern. "The preliminary calls I'm getting from the board aren't good, Richard. There are questions about fiduciary responsibility, about whether you've breached your duties to the shareholders by making such a significant change to your personal circumstances without disclosure." "My marriage is not a business decision," Richard said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that his corporate adversaries had learned to fear over the decades. "When you're worth $2 billion, everything is a business decision," Catherine snapped. "Your marriage affects inheritance law, community property, corporate governance. Did you sign a prenuptial agreement?" The silence that followed answered her question more clearly than words could have. Catherine's face went white. "Oh my God. Dad, do you understand what this means? Under California law, she could be entitled to half of everything you've acquired during the marriage. That includes the majority stake in Whitmore Industries, the real estate portfolio, the investment holdings." "Enough." Richard's voice cut through the room like a whip crack. "Elena is my wife, not some hostile takeover attempt. She married me when she thought I was a successful businessman, not when she knew I was worth billions. The distinction matters." But even as he defended Elena, Richard felt the first cold fingers of doubt creeping into his mind. Not doubt about Elena's character or motives. He knew her heart as well as he knew his own. The doubt was about what he had done to her by keeping the full truth of his wealth and power hidden. His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "The reporters are outside my shop. I'm scared, Richard. I don't understand what's happening." Reading her words, Richard felt something break inside his chest. In revealing their marriage to protect their relationship from his family's schemes, he had exposed her to a world she never asked to be part of. The woman who had brought peace to his golden years was now trapped in the crossfire of a battle she didn't even know was being fought. Michael noticed his father's expression and moved closer. "What is it?" "She's at the shop. There are reporters there." Richard stood up, his decision made. "I'm going to get her." "Dad, no," Catherine said urgently. "If you leave now, if there are photos of you two together looking emotional or upset, it will only make things worse. Let us handle this professionally." "Handle this how?" Richard demanded. Michael and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke of conversations Richard hadn't been part of. of plans that had been forming while he agonized over revelations and confessions. "Let us talk to her," Michael said carefully. "Let us explain the situation, help her understand what she's gotten into. Maybe we can reach an arrangement that protects everyone." The word arrangement hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Richard realized with growing horror that his children were already plotting Elena's destruction. The Blacktown car pulled up outside Rodriguez Auto Repair with the quiet authority of money and power. Elena watched through her shop window as Michael and Catherine Whitmore emerged from the vehicle, their expensive clothes and calculated movements marking them as clearly as if they wore signs declaring their intentions. Elena had been expecting this visit since the news broke 6 hours earlier. The reporters had finally been convinced to move across the street, but their cameras remained trained on her shop like mechanical vultures waiting for fresh drama to unfold. She had closed the shop early and sent her part-time assistant home, wanting privacy for whatever confrontation was about to occur. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal shavings, usually comforting, now seemed inadequate armor against the approaching storm. Michael knocked on the glass door with the confidence of someone accustomed to being admitted anywhere. Elena took a deep breath, wiped her hands one more time on her rag, and unlocked the door. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Michael said, his smile as polished and artificial as his handshake. "I'm Michael Whitmore, Richard's son. This is my sister Catherine. We were hoping we could have a few minutes of your time." Elena stepped aside to let them enter, noting how Catherine's eyes immediately began cataloging the shop's modest contents. The judgment in that gaze was unmistakable. This was not the environment where Catherine Whitmore expected to find her stepmother. "Please, sit down." Elena gestured to the waiting area, suddenly conscious of the duct-tape table and mismatched chairs that had never bothered her before. Catherine perched on the edge of one chair as if afraid of contamination, while Michael remained standing, using his height and expensive suit as tools of intimidation. "I want you to know that this is nothing personal," Michael began, his tone suggesting that it was, in fact, entirely personal. "But I'm sure you can understand our concern about this situation." "What situation would that be?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The marriage," Catherine said bluntly. "Dad says you've been married for 3 years, but none of us knew anything about it. That's quite unusual for our family." Elena met Catherine's gaze directly. "Your father wanted to keep our relationship private. I respected that decision." "But surely you understood why he wanted privacy," Michael said, beginning to pace in the small space. "A man in his position, with his responsibilities, there are people who would take advantage of such a relationship." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dirty exhaust pipe. Elena felt her cheeks flush, but her voice remained calm. "Are you suggesting that I married your father for his money?" "We're not suggesting anything," Catherine said smoothly. "We're simply trying to understand the situation from all angles. For instance, what did you think when Dad told you he was wealthy?" "He told me he was successful in business. I assumed that meant comfortable, not..." Elena gestured vaguely, encompassing the vast wealth that the Whitmore name represented. Michael stopped pacing and stared at her. "You didn't know? You really didn't know who he was?" "I knew he was Richard Whitmore, a kind man whose car broke down outside my shop. I knew he made me laugh and treated me with respect. I knew he brought me flowers every Friday and helped me balance my books on Sunday evenings. The rest of it..." Elena shrugged. "The rest of it never mattered to me." Catherine and Michael exchanged another of their loaded glances, and Elena realized she had just admitted something they found either completely unbelievable or extremely inconvenient. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Catherine said, leaning forward with what she probably thought was a sympathetic expression. "I'm sure you care for our father very much, but you have to understand. His marriage to you has created some very complex legal and financial complications." "What kind of complications?" Michael pulled out his phone and showed Elena a stock chart. Whitmore Industries has lost 12% of its value since this morning. Our shareholders are panicking because they don't know what this marriage means for the company's future. Our board of directors is calling for Dad's resignation. Elena stared at the numbers, feeling sick. I don't understand. How does our marriage affect the company? Community property law, Catherine explained with the patience of someone speaking to a child. In California, assets acquired during marriage belong equally to both spouses. That means you now have a legal claim to half of everything Dad has earned in the past 3 years, including his controlling stake in Whitmore Industries, Michael added, which means you now have the power to influence or even destroy a company that employs over 40,000 people. Elena sank back into her chair, the full weight of the situation finally becoming clear. I never wanted any of that. I don't want your father's money or his company. I just wanted to be his wife. We believe you, Catherine said, though her tone suggested otherwise. That's why we're here. We want to help you navigate the situation in a way that protects everyone involved. Michael sat down across from Elena, his expression shifting to what he probably thought was earnest sincerity. We've had our lawyers draw up some papers. Essentially, it's a post-nuptial agreement that clarifies the financial arrangements of your marriage. You would retain certain benefits, a modest monthly allowance, healthcare, housing assistance, while waiving any claim to the larger estate or company holdings. Elena looked at the documents Michael was pulling from his briefcase, the pages, crisp and official-looking. What does Richard think about these papers? The siblings exchanged another glance, and Catherine cleared her throat. Dad doesn't know about this conversation. We thought it would be better to discuss the options. With you first, woman to woman, so to speak. You mean without his interference, Elena said, and for the first time since they had arrived, her voice carried an edge. Michael's mask slipped slightly. Dad isn't thinking clearly right now. He's caught up in the emotional aspects of the situation and not seeing the bigger picture. But you seem like a practical woman. Surely you can see that this arrangement benefits everyone. Elena studied the papers, not reading the legal language, but absorbing the implicit threat they represented. Sign this, or face the full weight of the Whitmore family's displeasure. Sign this, or watch Richard's empire crumble while their marriage became a weapon used against him. And if I don't sign? Catherine's sympathetic facade finally cracked completely. Then you'll find yourself in the middle of a very public, very ugly legal battle. The media attention you've experienced today? That's nothing compared to what happens when this goes to court. Every detail of your life will be scrutinized, every past relationship examined, every financial transaction questioned. They'll paint you as a gold digger who seduced a lonely widower, Michael added. Your reputation, your business, your entire life will be destroyed. And in the end, Dad will still lose control of his company because the board won't allow this chaos to continue. Elena set the papers down on the duct-tape table, her hands steady now despite the fury building in her chest. She had spent her entire life building a reputation based on honesty and fair dealing. She had never cheated a customer, never taken advantage of someone's ignorance about engines to inflate a bill, never compromised her integrity for financial gain. These people, with their expensive clothes and cold eyes, were asking her to betray, not just her husband, but herself. I need to think about this, Elena said finally. Of course, Catherine stood up, smoothing her skirt. But please don't take too long. Every day this situation continues. More damage is done to everyone involved. Michael left his business card on the table next to the unsigned papers. Call me when you've made your decision. And Mrs. Rodriguez, please consider what's best for Dad. This kind of stress, at his age, with his health history, it could kill him. They left as quietly as they had arrived, but their threats lingered in the small office like toxic fumes. Elena sat in the growing darkness of her shop, surrounded by the tools and machines that had defined her life, and realized that everything she thought she knew about her marriage was about to change. Her phone buzzed with another text from Richard. I'm coming to get you. Don't talk to anyone until I arrive. But Elena knew it was already too late for that. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was no longer just Richard's wife. She was the enemy. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel of his Mercedes so tightly that his knuckles had turned white against the black leather. The evening traffic on the interstate moved at a frustrating crawl. Every delayed minute, another opportunity for his children to manipulate Elena into signing away her rights and his future. He had left the Whitmore Industries building through the parking garage, avoiding the reporters who had gathered in the lobby like sharks scenting blood in the water. His phone had been ringing constantly. Board members demanding explanations, investors threatening to pull funding, attorneys offering services he didn't want to need. But it was the call from his head of security that had made his blood run cold. Michael and Catherine had taken a company car to Elena's address 43 minutes ago. They were going behind his back, just as he had feared they would. As he finally exited the freeway and turned onto Maple Street, Richard could see the media circus that had transformed Elena's quiet neighborhood into a battleground. News vans lined both sides of the street. Their satellite dishes extended toward the darkening sky like electronic flowers seeking signal instead of sun. Reporters stood in clusters, their camera crews ready to capture any sign of drama. Richard parked across from the auto shop and studied the building that had become his sanctuary over the past 4 years. The hand-painted sign reading Rodriguez Auto Repair looked shabby compared to the sleek corporate logos he was accustomed to, but it represented something his billions couldn't buy: authenticity. He could see Elena through the shop window, sitting alone at her small desk, her shoulders curved with the weight of whatever poison his children had delivered. The sight of her obvious distress ignited a fury in Richard that he hadn't felt since his early days of building his empire, when competitors had underestimated him and paid the price. The reporters noticed him immediately, surging forward like a tide of expensive suits and aggressive questions. "Mr. Whitmore, is it true you've been secretly married for 3 years? What does this mean for the future of Whitmore Industries? Did you hide your marriage to avoid a prenuptial agreement?" Richard pushed through the crowd without acknowledging the questions, his focus entirely on reaching Elena. The shop door was locked, but she saw him coming and hurried to let him in, deadbolting it again behind him. For a moment, they simply held each other in the familiar environment of her workspace, surrounded by the tools and machines that had been witness to the growth of their relationship. Elena smelled like motor oil and vanilla perfume, the combination that had become his favorite scent in all the world. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I didn't prepare you for this." Elena pulled back to look at him, and he could see the steel in her dark eyes that had first attracted him, the strength that came from decades of surviving in a male-dominated profession through skill and determination, rather than connections and inherited wealth. "Your children were here," she said simply. Richard's jaw clenched. "What did they want?" Elena gestured to the papers scattered on her desk. "They want me to sign a postnuptial agreement. They want me to give up any claim to your wealth or your company." Richard moved to the desk and began reading the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. The agreement was comprehensive and ruthless, essentially reducing Elena to the status of a kept woman with no legal rights to the assets of their marriage. "They told me that if I don't sign, the media will destroy my reputation and your company will be ruined," Elena continued, her voice steady despite the tremor. He could see in her hands. "They said the stress could kill you. They're trying to scare you," Richard said, though he knew there was truth in their threats. The Whitmore children had inherited his business acumen along with his stubborn determination, and they would use both against Elena if necessary. "Are they wrong?" Elena asked. "About the company? About the media attention? About what this marriage means legally?" Richard set down the papers and took her hands in his. They were calloused from decades of honest work, marked with small scars from tools and engines, and more precious to him than any of the art or jewelry he had accumulated over a lifetime of wealth. "Legally, yes, you're entitled to half of what I've earned during our marriage. But Elena, I want you to have it. I want you to be protected, to be secure. I should have told you about the money from the beginning, should have insisted on updating my will and estate planning the day we got married." "I don't want your money, Richard," Elena said fiercely. "I never wanted your money. I fell in love with the man who spent 3 hours helping me rebuild Mrs. Chen's carburetor, even though he was wearing a $1,000 suit. I fell in love with the man who brings me coffee every morning and listens to me complain about difficult customers and tells me stories about places I've never been." "I know," Richard said. "But wanting it or not wanting it doesn't change the reality of what you're legally entitled to. And it doesn't change the fact that my children see you as a threat to their inheritance." Elena moved to the window and looked out at the circus of reporters and cameras. "Maybe they're right to see me as a threat. Maybe I am destroying everything you've built." "No." Richard joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What I built was a company, Elena. What you gave me was a life. There's a difference. But the employees, the shareholders, will survive whatever changes come, but I won't survive losing you. Not again." Elena turned in his arms, confusion crossing her features. Again? Richard realized he had never told her the complete truth about their connection, had never explained why a broken-down Bentley outside her shop had felt like destiny rather than coincidence. "Elena Rodriguez," he said softly. Age 19, student at City College, worked part-time at Martinez Auto Repair on 5th Street in 1975. You rebuilt the engine in my first car, a used Camaro I could barely afford. I was 24, just starting my first business, and I fell in love with you the moment you explained why my timing belt was shot. Elena's eyes widened as memory flooded back. Ricky Whitmore? I went by Richard when I started the company. Sounded more professional. He smiled at the wonder in her expression. I looked for you for years after you disappeared. Martinez said you'd moved back to take care of your mother, but I didn't know where. My mother had a stroke, Elena whispered. I had to leave school, come home to run Dad's shop. By the time I came back to the city, Martinez said you'd gotten rich and married some society woman. I married Margaret because I thought you were gone forever. I built the company because I needed something to fill the space where you should have been. Richard cupped her face in his hands. When I saw you that day 4 years ago, when my car broke down in front of your shop, I knew fate was giving us a second chance. Elena was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she processed the revelation that their love story stretched back decades rather than years. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid, Richard admitted. Afraid that if you knew how much I'd thought about you, how much I'd regretted losing you, you'd think I was some obsessed old man trying to relive his youth. A loud banging on the shop door interrupted them, followed by Michael's voice. Dad, we know you're in there. We need to talk. Richard and Elena looked at each other, and in that moment, they both understood that the gentle phase of this battle was over. Michael and Catherine had made their opening move, and now it was time for Richard to remind his children why he had built an empire while they had merely inherited one. Let them in, Richard said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made him billions. It's time for them to understand exactly who they're trying to threaten. Elena unlocked the door, and Michael and Catherine entered like conquering generals, their confidence faltering only slightly when they saw the unsigned papers still scattered on the desk. Dad, thank God, Catherine began. We've been trying to protect. Shut up, Richard said quietly, and the simple command carried such force that both his children immediately fell silent. Elena has told me about your visit, about your threats, about your amateur attempt at manipulation. Michael's face flushed red. Dad, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, Richard interrupted. I understand that you've spent your entire lives believing you were entitled to my wealth simply by virtue of being born. I understand that you see my marriage as a threat to that entitlement. and I understand that you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you threaten someone I love. The battle for the Whitmore fortune was about to begin in earnest, and Richard Whitmore had not become a billionaire by losing wars. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. sharp on a gray Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Richard's yacht revelation had sent shockwaves through the corporate world. The Whitmore Industries boardroom, usually a sanctuary of polished mahogany and muted conversations, buzzed with tension as 12 of the most powerful business leaders in California took their seats around the massive conference table. Richard entered the room with Elena at his side, her simple black dress and modest jewelry, a stark contrast to the expensive suits and designer accessories surrounding her. She had spent the weekend at Richard's Malibu estate, away from the media circus, and he had used that time to show her the full scope of his empire, not to intimidate her, but to help her understand exactly what they were fighting for. Michael and Catherine sat at the far end of the table, their faces carefully composed masks of professional concern. They had spent the week building alliances, making calls, and positioning themselves as the stable leadership the company needed in these uncertain times. Board Chairman Harrison Webb, a silver-haired man who had worked with Richard for over 20 years, called the meeting to order with obvious reluctance. Richard, I want to be clear that this emergency session was not my idea. However, given the developments of the past week, the board feels it necessary to address certain concerns about corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility. Let's skip the diplomatic language, Harrison, said Margaret Thornfield, the board's only other female member and Catherine's longtime ally. The question before us today is simple. Has Richard Whitmore's secret marriage compromised his ability to lead this company? Richard remained seated, his hand resting gently on Elena's. Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify a few misconceptions that seem to have taken root over the past week. He stood and moved to the presentation screen, clicking through a series of documents he had prepared. First, my marriage to Elena was not secret because I was ashamed of it, or because I was trying to hide assets from her. It was private because I wanted to protect her from exactly the kind of media scrutiny and corporate manipulation she has endured this past week. The first slide showed their marriage certificate, their wedding photos, and documentation of Richard's attempt to update his will immediately after the ceremony. Updates that had been delayed by his lawyer's insistence on extensive prenuptial negotiations. Second, Richard continued, the notion that Elena is a gold digger or fortune hunter is not only false, it's insulting to everyone in this room who claims to understand character and motivation. The next slide showed Elena's financial records, her business tax returns, and documentation of every attempt she had made to refuse expensive gifts or lavish spending from Richard during their marriage. Elena Rodriguez has never accepted more than $50 in gifts from me at any one time. She insisted on paying her own way on every vacation, refused my attempts to buy her a new car or upgrade her shop equipment, and has never once asked about my net worth, my investments, or my estate planning. Margaret Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in her seat. That's all very touching, Richard, but the legal reality remains unchanged. Under California community property law, Richard interrupted, Elena is entitled to half of everything I have acquired during our marriage, and I want her to have it. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. More than that, Richard continued, I want her to have all of it. Michael shot to his feet. Dad, you can't be serious. Sit down, Michael. Richard's voice carried the authority that had built this company from nothing. I'm not finished. He clicked to the next slide, showing a legal document that made several board members gasp audibly. This morning, I signed papers transferring my entire stake in Whitmore Industries, 68% of outstanding shares, to Elena Rodriguez Whitmore. Effective immediately, she is the majority owner of this company. The chaos that erupted in the boardroom was immediate and deafening. Voices rose in anger, disbelief, and panic as board members realized that the quiet woman in the simple black dress now controlled their fates and their fortunes. Catherine's face had gone completely white. This is insane. Dad, You've lost your mind. The shareholders will revolt. The SEC will investigate. The shareholders, Richard said calmly, will do what shareholders always do. They'll follow the money, and the money will follow Elena's leadership. Elena stood up slowly, and the room gradually fell silent as all eyes turned to her. For a moment, she looked exactly like what she was, a working-class woman who had never imagined she would find herself in a corporate boardroom surrounded by titans of industry. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the quiet confidence that had attracted Richard 50 years earlier. Mr. Webb, members of the board, I understand your concern. A week ago, I was a mechanic who owned a small auto repair shop. Today, apparently, I own a corporation worth billions of dollars. That transition would be frightening for anyone. She moved to stand beside Richard, her hand finding his with natural ease. But I want you to understand something about the man you're questioning. Richard Whitmore didn't transfer his shares to me because he's lost his judgment or because he's being manipulated. He did it because he trusts me to protect what he's built while remembering what truly matters. Margaret Thornfield leaned forward, her expression skeptical. And what exactly do you think truly matters, Mrs. Whitmore? The 43,000 people who work for this company, Elena replied without hesitation. Their families, their communities, their futures. Richard didn't build Whitmore Industries to create a monument to his own ego. He built it to create opportunities, to solve problems, to make things work better. She gestured toward Michael and Catherine, who sat in stunned silence. His children see this company as their inheritance, something they're entitled to by birthright. But inheritance isn't about what you're given. It's about what you do with what you're given. And what they want to do is maintain the status quo while the world changes around them. Elena walked to the presentation screen and clicked to a slide that clearly surprised everyone, including Richard. She had prepared her own presentation. I spent this weekend learning about Whitmore Industries, not the financial reports or stock prices, but the actual work being done. Did you know that your automotive division is still using manufacturing processes that are 20 years out of date? Did you know that your environmental compliance costs have increased 40% over the past 2 years because nobody wanted to invest in cleaner technologies? The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances as Elena continued. Richard showed me the innovation labs, the research and development facilities, the patents gathering dust because implementing new technologies might affect quarterly profits. This company isn't dying because of my marriage to Richard. It's dying because it stopped evolving. Michael found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. You can't possibly think you're qualified to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Elena smiled, and for the first time since entering the boardroom, she looked completely at ease. You're right. I'm not qualified to run a corporation, but I am qualified to fix things that are broken, and I'm qualified to recognize when something isn't working the way it should. She clicked to the next slide, showing a detailed organizational chart that made several board members lean forward with interest. I'm proposing we restructure Whitmore Industries into 3 separate entities. The manufacturing division becomes an employee-owned cooperative, with workers sharing in both the decision-making and the profits. The technology and patents division becomes a research foundation, focused on developing solutions for environmental and social challenges rather than just maximizing returns. And the financial holdings become a trust fund dedicated to supporting small businesses and innovation. Harrison Webb frowned thoughtfully. That's actually not entirely unreasonable, but the logistics alone would be handled by people far more qualified than me, Elena interrupted. Richard has spent 50 years building relationships with the best minds in business, law, and technology. I'm not proposing to replace his expertise with my ignorance. I'm proposing to use his expertise in service of different goals. She looked directly at Michael and Catherine, her expression compassionate but unwavering. Your father is offering you something much more valuable than money. He's offering you the chance to be part of building something meaningful, something that will matter long after all of us are gone. You can be bitter about losing your inheritance, or you can be excited about gaining a purpose. Catherine stood up abruptly, her chair sliding backward. This is ridiculous. You're asking us to give up billions of dollars so you can play social worker with Dad's company. I'm asking you to help me honor what your father actually built, Elena replied. But if you can't do that, then yes, I'm asking you to step aside so others can. Michael's face cycled through anger, disbelief, and something that might have been grief before settling into resignation. And if we refuse, if we fight this, Richard spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice gentle but firm. Then you'll discover that the lawyers you've been consulting work for me, not for you. The trust funds you've been relying on were set up by me and can be modified by me. The positions you hold in this company exist at my discretion, and now at Elena's. He paused, letting the implications sink in. But more than that, you'll discover that fighting someone you love is a battle where winning and losing are the same thing. The silence stretched for almost a minute before Harrison Webb cleared his throat. I think we need to adjourn this meeting to allow everyone time to process these developments. Mrs. Whitmore, would you be willing to meet with a smaller committee to discuss the practical implications of your proposals? Of course, Elena replied. But I want to be clear about something. These aren't just proposals. As of this morning, I legally own controlling interest in this company. I'm not asking for permission to make these changes. I'm offering you the opportunity to help implement them constructively. As the board members filed out of the room in clusters of worried conversation, Michael and Catherine remained seated, staring at their father and stepmother with expressions of shock and something approaching awe. 50 years, Catherine said quietly. You've been planning this for 50 years, haven't you? Looking for her, waiting for her. Richard nodded, his arm around Elena's shoulders. I spent 50 years building an empire because I thought that was what success looked like. It took Elena to show me that success is about building a life worth living. Michael shook his head slowly. The media is going to have a field day with this. Mechanic dismantles business empire. Love conquers corporate America. It's going to be chaos. Let them write their stories, Elena said, gathering her simple purse and preparing to leave the boardroom that would never be the same. People who understand will understand. People who don't understand will learn, eventually. As they walked toward the elevator, Richard reflected on the irony of the situation. He had spent decades accumulating power and wealth, building walls between himself and the world, protecting his empire from any threat or weakness. But it was only when he gave it all away, handed his life's work to a woman who valued honesty, over profit, and people over power, that he truly felt like he had won. The elevator doors closed on the three of them, carrying them away from the corporate battlefield and toward whatever future they would build together. Outside the tower's windows, the city sprawled endlessly, full of people working and struggling and dreaming. Elena squeezed Richard's hand and smiled. So, she said, I guess we should probably talk about what I'm going to do with $1 billion company. Actually, Richard replied, I was thinking we should talk about what you're going to do with the rest of our lives. Same thing, Elena said simply. Fix what's broken. Build something better. Take care of the people who matter. Richard looked at this remarkable woman who had agreed to marry him twice in one lifetime, who had taken his empire and transformed it into something he never could have imagined, who had shown him that love wasn't about what you owned, but about what you were willing to give away. I love you, Elena Rodriguez Whitmore, he said. I love you too, Ricky Whitmore, she replied, using the name from 50 years ago when they were both young and poor and certain that they could fix anything if they just had the right tools and enough determination. Some things, it turned out, never changed, and that was the most beautiful truth of all.